This is going to be a sword spear for a character from the Wheel of Time series. This is for Matrim Cauthon, and he has this Ashandarei, which is somewhere between a sword and a spear. This is the inspiration photo that I liked best. This is one of the suggestions from somebody on Reddit. Really like this version, and so that's what I'm going to go with for my prop. So I'm going to mostly be focusing on the blade today, and I'll show you how making the shaft later on. That's going to be out of PVC, but the blade is going to be quite an interesting mix of materials. So the first step, of course, we need to get a sketch made out. So based on the sizing of the PVC and the fittings, that's going to determine how big I think it's called the tang portion is for the sword. That's going to go down into the actual shaft. The sketch, I'm kind of freehanding, a mix of freehand and actually measuring it out using a straight edge. It's just based on what kind of looks like the picture and what seems like it's going to work best with the costume. So I don't want it to be too large so as to be impractical, but it is going to end up being about 6.5 feet tall altogether. The blade itself is about 2 feet. I'm using just some thick brown paper, actually the paper that I normally use to protect my tabletops. Now that I have a paper pattern, I'm going to do the first layer of the actual sword blade. Now this is just kind of a maybe even just 1 millimeter or less piece of plastic that I had lying around. The point of this layer is so that I have something to give the finest point of the blade some rigidity, so I can use that as an edge when I'm sanding too, to keep from grinding away too much of the foam. With foam, it's so easy to just kind of go to town, and then you end up with a little bit of a nub left as opposed to the beautiful sword that you were trying to make. But this plastic is going to keep that from happening. So I didn't have a big enough piece to do it all as one, so I'm just kind of piecing it together, sketching it out, and then I'm just going to tape it all together. It'll be just fine. The other nice thing about having this plastic layer is it's going to make it easy to use as a cutting guide for some of the other foam layers that are going to be going on top. Packing tape is pretty sturdy stuff, so it's going to work well for making this piecemeal plastic into one lovely pattern and centerpiece for the blade. Next, I'm using some 6mm craft foam. You could use the foam floor mats for this type of layer, but I didn't really feel like messing with sanding off the textured side, and I already had several sheets of the 6mm that's smooth on both sides. Also, this thickness works pretty well for the layering technique I'm using here. That's going to involve using some coroplast, a couple layers of foam. So the thickness works out pretty well. I wanted this blade to be hefty, but I don't want it to be so thick that it looks disproportionate with the handle. The only slightly annoying thing with these foamy sheets is that they do have that staple in the corner. In this case, it doesn't matter because I'm pretty much just using the center of the sheet anyway, but that can get annoying sometimes when your sheet's just the right size, except for you've got a hole in the corner. Just using some contact adhesive to piece together some smaller sheets to make the full length of the sword. It's not going to matter structurally with it being multiple pieces because contact adhesive is fantastic for holding everything together. Plus, there's going to be so many different layers in this that the seams won't all line up, so it will be plenty strong. Probably would have been easier to glue it all together and then trace it out, but, hindsight. I did it differently the second time around because we do need to cut actually 2 of these because there's going to be a center plastic layer. Then there's going to be 2 outer layers of this 6mm foam. And then I'm going to do a couple of layers of a thinner foam. Now when you're cutting craft foam, do make sure you have a nice sharp blade. That is the key to getting clean cuts. So I do have this sharpener, some WD-40. I just give it a good sharpen every few cuts when it starts getting a little bit dull and you're not getting that super clean, just glide right through kind of cut. When it's sharp, it's a breeze to cut. When it's dull, everything looks terrible no matter how careful you are. For this, I'm just keeping my blade pretty much vertical because I'm going to sand the beveled edge in later for the sword. So right now I just want to have everything pretty much line up, and then I will figure out the exact angle of the blade later on once more of the pieces are together. Definitely use a straight edge for anywhere that is a more of a geometric line versus the curve of the blade. Really, you just have to freehand it. Just do it one clean motion and it's going to come out just fine. Then we've got this plastic again. That's going to help to get everything nice and even. If your cut wasn't absolutely perfect on the foam layer, it will be no big deal. That plastic layer is awesome for cutting out several layers of just out of 2mm craft foam. I've got a whole roll of this black craft foam because it's excellent to have on hand for all sorts of things, and in this case it's perfect for some outer layers for the sword. I don't have one piece of foam that's thick enough, but this layer method is kind of nice because I do need to have a nice carbon fiber rod going down the center of this. That's going to keep everything rigid, and then that's going to pass straight from the blade down into the handle so that it's all nice and sturdy and not wobbling around or potentially breaking just while you're hanging on to it at the con. I do need to cut out this hole from the center of the plastic because the carbon fiber rod will be centered in that portion, and then it will fill up the 2 layers of 6mm foam pretty much once you add in some hot glue. So I'm just trimming out that center layer from both pieces of craft foam in addition to the plastic piece. Again, use a straight edge if it's a straight line. Might as well keep it nice and neat, even though this part isn't actually going to show. So here is our sandwich so far, and you see the carbon fiber rod fits nicely in there. And this is just a hollow rod, but it's very rigid and it feels quite sturdy, so I think it's going to work perfectly for this because the prop itself is going to be fairly lightweight. You don't want something heavy really to carry around at a con. It just, seems light at first, and then after you carry it around for 30 minutes, 40 minutes, 4 hours, it definitely starts to feel a little bit heavier. Now I am using the center portion of my paper pattern to cut 2 pieces out of 2mm coroplast. This is going to serve as another rigid layer. It's going to keep that carbon fiber rod from possibly poking through on if it were just the thin craft foam on the outside. So this is going to be a nice sturdy layer on each side of that carbon fiber rod. You can trim the 2mm with scissors, no problem. And then on one of the layers of the 2mm craft foam, I need 2 pieces of that to have the center cut out because that's going to make the coroplast layer flat. I don't want the coroplast to go all the way out to the edge because that won't sand well for when we're actually putting the sharp edge onto the blade. So that's why I'm doing partial coroplast and then the edge out of foam on that particular layer. So I have all of these layers cut out and ready to sandwich together. Now I just need to use a lot of contact adhesive. Now, this got pretty messy. I really should have put on gloves from the start. But at first I was being really, really neat, and then I accidentally stuck something where it wasn't supposed to go, had to emergency pry it up off of the cardboard, and yeah, my hands got pretty well glued. So wear gloves, just do it. Also, don't put the contact adhesive on both sides of a piece. Do one side of each of the parts that are going to stick together, let them dry, then stick them together, and then do the back side for the next part of the sandwich. Because if you put glue on one side and then you flip it over on your surface, then it kind of probably is going to stick to that surface if you've been getting glue everywhere. So don't rush it too much. So in the layer that's the 6mm craft foam, that white layer, I'm going to extend the rigid part. I don't want, of course, that thick rod to go all the way up because it's not going to fit the curve of the blade. So I have just some little teeny tiny thin carbon fiber pieces that I'm going to use 2 of them on each side of the white foam and just hot glue that in place just to ensure that the tip of the blade isn't unstable, that it doesn't wobble or bend too much, because 1, it would look weird, and 2, I don't want it to start damaging the finish on the outside or any sort of filler that we might use later on. Hot glue is fantastic for this type of thing where we aren't worried about having it like really flat. When you're gluing layers of foam together, contact adhesive is better because it doesn't take up much space. But when you're filling in a gap that has supports in it, hot glue is perfect, and it's fast and neat and not so stinky. So I am actually gluing that carbon fiber rod into one side and then sticking the sandwich together. So overall we have a center layer of plastic, then a layer of 6mm craft foam, then the 2mm coroplast with a foam edge that's also the 2mm foam, and then finally a single piece of 2mm craft foam on the outside of each side of the blade, so that we have a nice smooth so that we have a nice smooth surface to attach that center detail that I'll show you in a little bit. It's time to kind of rough cut in that blade. Now, it's not going to be perfect just yet because we have to put the center piece on, the center detailing, to finalize exactly the angle of the blade, but definitely can get a pretty good head start on that. I absolutely love my Dremel extension because, my hands get so tired sanding, trying to hold a giant Dremel. It just is not ergonomic for someone with hands of my size. So this extension is excellent. I highly, highly recommend getting one of those. It's inexpensive and will save you a lot of hand fatigue. So I'm starting on the handle here for this. I'm not actually going to show you the whole thing in this particular video because this video is just getting really, really, really long. So I'll show you the handle next time, but basically it's PVC and different fittings that I just found at the home improvement store that work for what I want this to be able to do, which is to unscrew. And because those pieces, I'm using them in a way they weren't actually intended. They don't, have a tension fit together. They don't fit together themselves, so I just am plastic welding them together, more like plastic riveting, I guess. Just a piece of filament, you melt it with the soldering tool, stick in the filament, melt it again, and then sand off any extra. It holds these really securely without too much effort. So this is how the handle is going to fit onto the blade using that carbon fiber rod. I just need to mark out the size that it needs to be to fit down into that fitting. So I'm just going to Sharpie that a little bit and then just give everything a bit more trimming. It's a process of removing more material over time because it's a lot easier just to take off a little more later than to overdo it from the start and have to go in and fill and sand and all that, which we're going to be doing some filling for sure, but the overall shape, I'm just going to slowly work my way into it. So that's about the right size now for this fitting. So it is time to move on to creating the center detail. I'm going to have a raven at the base of the sword, just like that inspiration photo. And so I got some inspiration pictures from online, and then I'm just making my version that's going to be 3D printable. I like starting in Adobe Illustrator because for me it's the easiest way to be able to change my mind on exactly where my lines are and kind of adjust the curves, as opposed to doing it straight in the 3D modeling software, which I'm still working in 123D Design. I need to upgrade to something else, but I just haven't had time to learn a new software just yet. So I'm just sketching everything out here based on some inspiration pictures and fine-tuning it to where it looks just about right and printable. I took a photo from above of the center shape, and then that needs to be scaled to be like actually the right size. So the easiest way is just to have this on something that you know the exact size. Like each of these little squares on the cutting mat is 1/2 inch. So I scaled everything to where those squares ended up being 1/2 inch based on the rulers within the design software. So now I know that once I draw everything, it's going to be true to size when I go and switch that over to the 3D modeling software and then to the slicer and then to the printer. The raven needs to be scaled down a little bit and mirrored and whatnot just to find the right placement and sizing and fit to where it looks just about right. So I think it's going to be about right here. I'm going to add an inset here that has a beveled edge, so I just want to offset that line. Maybe 6 millimeters. No, that's a little too big, so let me make that just a little bit smaller. I think down to 4 millimeters will be just about the right size to leave room for the raven. I don't want to make the raven too small because I know any smaller than this and it's going to have trouble being easy to see and clear once it 3D prints. So we want to keep that as large as possible. Now I'm going to export that as an SVG, and then I will be importing that into my 3D modeling software. So in 123D Design, it's going to import it at exactly the size that I created it in Adobe Illustrator, so I know that this is the correct size to fit on my sword. The first step is always to save your file and then save often throughout, especially if you're still working in 123D Design, because in my experience, this program crashes a lot, which is another reason I want to switch to something else, but I will get to that eventually. So I'm just going to extrude this about 2 millimeters here. That's going to be the overall height, but then there's going to be an inset also. So the first step after extruding it is to bevel the edge. So I just want to select all of the edges on one side of this. Obviously, it's going to be, one side and then print a second one in a mirror version to go on the other side of the sword. So it wouldn't let me do it at the full 2 millimeters because that's the exact height. So I'm going to just do it at, like 1.9. Yeah, that'll work. Sometimes it's a little fiddly. You just have to see what works and what's close enough to what you need and just go with it, not waste time with worrying about too many little details that aren't going to matter in the 3D printed version anyways. Taking out the center just because I want to make that lower, so I just extruded it through as a subtraction, and now I'm just going to re-extrude that as 1 millimeter for the center portion. And that leaves me with a nice little inset that's going to look pretty nice 3D printed. Now I'm taking some artistic liberty here with the detailing on the rest of the blade. I mean, this is not something that's in the book, although I don't think there's all that many details available in the book, but I just decided this would look pretty sweet if there was dice going up this. I know that's kind of a theme for this character, and I think it's going to look pretty cool once it's printed. So I'm just kind of doing some cylinders that I'll be subtracting, and then also squares that I'll be subtracting, and just to fiddle with those until they look about right. Mess with the scaling and make them transition well all the way up the blade, keeping in mind what's going to actually 3D print well. And then just subtract everything from that. Now the portion of the die, the actual square, that's only partially subtracted, not a full cutout. The dots actually go all the way through. And then it didn't look quite right, so I'm just going to use that same pattern of squares that has a graduation, to a smaller size, and reposition those to make little diamond cutouts between the dice, and then subtract those all the way through, so we get this really interesting pattern that I think suits the shape of the sword pretty well. So now that everything is subtracted on the top part, I just want to make the bottom part a little more interesting and subtract that also to have a little bit of an inset. Then this has to be printed in two parts. My printer is not large enough to print the whole entire thing, so you just cut it in half and export it as two separate files. Set that up to print. I'm using similar settings to those that I've used for rubber stamps. I'm printing this in semi-flex, except this can print pretty fast because there's nothing overly complicated. So I'm going to print it at 30 millimeters per second. I think that's going to be fine. This is another case where I don't want to bother changing the nozzle, but when I set it to the 0.6 nozzle size, it's not registering the details as clearly as I would like with regards to the Raven. So I just put that to 0.4 and adjusted my other settings accordingly, just to give it a little extra flow. I find 110% works pretty well on my printer. And that way we'll get a little more detail without the bother of swapping out nozzles and having to re-level and whatnot. I avoid that as much as possible. It's ready to print now. I've just got to export both of the files. Now remember to export or to save this as one direction, and then the mirror version, I forgot to do that the first time and had to reprint the other side of the sword because I had 2 exact copies. It just doesn't work. So I'm going to print everything out in semi-flex because I had plenty of that, and pretty much any filament's probably going to work on this. You could use something rigid, you can use something flexible like this. I really like the flexible filament because it is so durable. It prints out really nicely, and it's also going to, because it has some flexibility to it, it's going to glue nicely to my sword. Even if the foam isn't, perfectly level, if there's some little bumps or whatnot in there, I'm not going to end up with gaps along the edge. So I think that's going to work pretty darn well. It's really difficult not to just sit and watch the printer when it's printing these things. So there it is. Of course, it's always fun trying to pry these off of the print bed, but when it's something thin like this, you can, fold it up and pry it off with a spatula. But man, these flexible filaments stick so well to print bite. And the top half is, again, it's quite interesting to watch. I would just like to sit there and watch it go, but I have too much to do, so just got some little snapshots here, and you can see how those different raised areas, the different details really start to pop once they're in 3D. And we're gonna just have to stick those together now. So I'm just gonna use the wood burner to attach them. But there's basically how it's going to look on the sword, and I think it looks pretty sweet. This actually turned out better than I was expecting. So I'm happy with it. It was worth the time spent figuring out what I wanted it to look like. So I'm just using the wood burner to attach those 2 pieces together. We'll fill and smooth it later on, so I'm not too worried about it being a tiny bit rough at this point. And then once both pieces are joined together for each side, we're just going to use some more contact adhesive. Obviously, you got to put it on the back of that piece and then on the sword too. Now, a little tip for this, I would not let it dry completely on this because it's nice to be able to reposition it a little bit when it's something that you need it to kind of line up on both sides of the sword. It's a little bit hard to tell when you're first sticking it on. So I just put lots of the contact adhesive on and stuck it on while it was still wet. Because the printed portion is non-porous, it doesn't, bond permanently right away. So you do have a little bit of an opportunity to adjust it as needed, which I needed. Time to further refine that blade now that we have the centerpiece on. That works as a guide for where the end point of the edge will be towards the center. And then that plastic layer in the middle is fantastic for guiding your sanding for the outer edge. And then just trim up any little bits at that tip. Because the tip did get a little bit wonky. I had to fill it in with a little bit of hot glue and whatnot, just because it does get so small. But because there's the carbon fiber rods in there, overall it's quite sturdy. There's a little bit of flex to it still because it does thin out towards the end. But I think that's working pretty well. This is a pretty fun project, so I'm looking forward to continuing on with it. I had to finish it up in the next couple weeks just because it is actually going to be used at JordanCon coming up. We're going to stop there for now on this project. In the next video, I'm going to show you making the whole handle for it out of PVC with a wood grain effect. It's going to look pretty sweet. And then I'm going to be engraving the text in the old tongue. So yes, I had to do quite a bit of research on the old tongue to try to figure out how to do that to the best of my ability with the information that's available. Considering it's not an actual full language and it's not like Elvish, so there's some guesswork involved, but it'll be close enough. I'll get the idea across. I try, guys. So make sure that if you haven't already subscribed, you go ahead and do that now and then click that bell so that you get notified when the next part of this project comes out and then other projects upcoming. Thank you for watching. I'll see you soon. What's that? What's that? Yes. Yeah, baby. Yes, baby. Okay. Alright, I'll leave you back to your nap now, okay? Okay? Okay.